He'd been cutting hair in the same chair for 30 years. Never said much, just snip, brush, next customer. But when the young Marine sat down and rolled up his sleeves, the old barber's hands froze mid-cut. There on the kid's forearm was a tattoo he hadn't seen in decades, a symbol that made his own scars ache with memory. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful tale of recognition, respect, and hidden brotherhood, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These moments of truth matter more than we know. The barbershop sat on the corner of Main and 3rd, wedged between a hardware store and a diner that had seen better decades. Inside, time moved differently. The mirrors were spotted with age, the leather chairs cracked but comfortable, and the smell of barbicide mixed with Old Spice created an atmosphere that belonged to another era. Frank Castellano had owned the place since 1994. He was 73 now, moved a little slower than he used to, but his hands were still steady. Steady enough to give a clean shave, steady enough to trim a mustache without drawing blood, steady enough to hide the tremor that sometimes came when he remembered things he'd rather forget. Most customers saw exactly what they expected to see. An old Italian barber with thick glasses, a slight stoop, and the patience of someone who'd heard every story twice. They didn't notice the way he positioned himself to see both the front door and the back exit. They didn't notice how his eyes tracked movement on the street. They didn't notice the small scar that ran from his left ear to his jawline, usually hidden by the angle of his head. Frank preferred it that way. The morning routine never changed. Unlock the door at 7 a.m. sharp. Turn on the radio. Always the same oldies station. Check the cash register, though he rarely had more than $40 in it overnight. Sweep the floor even though he'd swept it the night before. Arrange his tools with the precision of a surgeon, scissors, combs, razors, each in their designated place. By 7:15, the coffee would be brewing in the back room and Frank would settle into his chair to wait for the first customer. Usually it was old Pete from the apartment upstairs who came down every Wednesday for a trim and stayed for an hour of complaints about the weather, the government, and his arthritis. But this Tuesday was different. The young man who walked through the door at 7:23 a.m. wasn't from the neighborhood. Frank could tell immediately. The posture, the way he scanned the room before sitting down, the deliberate placement of his hands. Military, recent military. "Morning," the young man said, settling into the chair. "Just a trim, please, nothing fancy." Frank nodded, draped the cape around the young man's shoulders, and began his work. The kid was maybe 25, clean-shaven, with the kind of haircut that was already regulation short. Dark hair, serious eyes, and a stillness that Frank recognized. "You're new in town," Frank said, more statement than question. "Yes, sir. Just moved here last week, starting a job at the VA hospital." Frank's hands paused for just a moment. The VA hospital was 20 minutes away, served veterans from 3 counties. "Good work, important work." He resumed cutting. "That's good work," Frank said simply. The young man nodded. "Yes, sir. I figure I owe something back." They worked in comfortable silence after that. Frank had always been good at reading people. And this kid had the weight of someone who'd seen things. Not the broken weight. Frank knew that look too. but the careful, controlled weight of someone who'd learned to carry what they'd experienced. It was when the young man rolled up his sleeves to check his watch that Frank saw it. The tattoo was small, maybe 2 inches across, positioned on the inside of the left forearm where it would normally be hidden by a long-sleeved shirt. Most people would have seen just another military tattoo. They were common enough. But Frank's hands stopped moving entirely. It wasn't the image itself that made his breath catch. It was the specific details. The way the eagle's wings were positioned, the particular style of the anchor. The small number 7 worked into the design in a way that looked accidental but wasn't. Frank had seen that exact tattoo before. He'd seen it on the arm of a man named Rodriguez in a place that didn't officially exist, during an operation that had never been recorded. The young man noticed Frank had stopped cutting. "Everything okay, sir?" Frank's mouth was dry. He set down his scissors carefully, his hands not quite steady anymore. "That tattoo," Frank said quietly. "Where did you get it?" The young man's expression changed, not defensive but careful. It's a unit tattoo, sir, from my deployment." "Which unit?" There was a long pause. The young man studied Frank's face in the mirror, and Frank could see him making calculations, deciding how much to say. "I'm not sure I should." "Marine Force Recon," Frank said. "7th Company, Afghanistan, 2019 to 2021. The young man went very still. "How did you know that?" Frank walked around to face him directly. With shaking hands, he unbuttoned his shirt cuff and rolled up his left sleeve. There, faded and blurred with age but unmistakable, was the same tattoo. Same eagle, same anchor, same hidden 7. But Frank's version was different in one crucial detail. Where the young man's tattoo was crisp and new, Frank's was surrounded by scar tissue. Old scar tissue. "Vietnam," Frank said simply. 1971 to 1973, same unit, different war. The young man stared at the tattoo, then at Frank's face, then back at the tattoo. "You were Force Recon?" 7th Company didn't exist in Vietnam," Frank said. "Officially, just like it doesn't exist now." Understanding dawned in the young man's eyes. He knew what that meant. Some units, some operations, some wars were fought in the spaces between official history. "What's your name, son?" "Martinez, sir. Corporal David Martinez." Frank extended his hand. "Frank Castellano, Staff Sergeant, retired." They shook hands, and Frank could feel the calluses on Martinez's palm, the particular roughness that came from handling weapons and rappelling ropes and doing things that required strong hands and steady nerves. "Staff Sergeant," Martinez said, and there was something different in his voice now. Respect, but also recognition. "I heard stories about the old-timers, the guys who did the impossible stuff before anyone was keeping track." Frank released his hand and rolled his sleeve back down. "We all did what we had to do. Sir, with respect, that's not what I heard. I heard about a team that went into Cambodia in '72. Extraction mission, brought out 12 POWs that weren't supposed to exist." Frank's hands stilled again. That operation had been classified at levels that didn't have names. The fact that this young Marine knew about it meant, "Who told you that story?" "My CO, Colonel Harrison. He said if I ever met an old-timer with the 7th Company Inc., I should listen to whatever he had to say." Frank knew that name. Harrison had been a lieutenant when Frank knew him, young and eager and scared out of his mind during his first deployment. Frank had pulled him out of a burning helicopter in Laos in 1973. Harrison still active? Yes, sir. He's the one who recommended me for the VA job. Said I should find somewhere quiet to decompress, somewhere I could do some good. Frank nodded slowly. Harrison had always been smart enough to know that some soldiers needed time to process what they'd seen, what they'd done. Smart enough to know that helping other veterans was often the best medicine for a warrior's soul. He was right, Frank said, about finding somewhere quiet. Martinez looked around the barber shop, the old mirrors, the worn chairs, the peaceful silence. Is that what you did, sir? Found somewhere quiet? Frank picked up his scissors again, resumed cutting Martinez's hair, but his movements were different now, more deliberate. He was thinking. I found somewhere I could be useful, Frank said finally. Somewhere I could take care of people without anyone asking questions about where I learned how. Cutting hair? Among other things. Martinez was quiet for a moment, then, the VA job. It's counseling work, helping guys transition back to civilian life. That's important work. Yes, sir. But I'm not sure I'm qualified. I mean, I know what it's like to come back, but I don't know if I know how to help other people with it. Frank finished the haircut, brushed the loose hair from Martinez's shoulders, removed the cape. In the mirror, Martinez looked younger somehow, less burdened. You want some advice, Corporal? Yes, sir. Frank leaned against the counter, studying the young man's face. The guys you'll be working with, they're not looking for someone who has all the answers. They're looking for someone who understands the questions. Martinez nodded slowly. And they're looking for someone who won't judge them for the things they had to do, or the things they couldn't do, or the things they wish they'd done differently. How do you do that, sir? How do you not judge? Frank was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the morning traffic was picking up. The hardware store next door was opening, the owner raising the metal security gate with a rattle that Frank had heard every morning for 30 years. You remember that everyone who made it home is carrying something, Frank said finally. And everyone who didn't make it home is being carried by someone else. Your job isn't to fix that. Your job is to help people carry it better. Martinez stood up, reached for his wallet. Frank waved him away. First cut's free for family. Family? Frank tapped his own forearm where the tattoo was hidden beneath his sleeve. 7th Company. Different wars. Same brotherhood. Martinez extended his hand again. This time, when Frank shook it, he felt something different. Not just respect, but connection. The kind of connection that existed between men who'd seen the same darkness and chosen to keep walking toward the light. Staff Sergeant, can I ask you something? Shoot. Do you ever regret it? The quiet life, I mean. Don't you ever want people to know what you did? Frank looked around his barber shop. At the simple chairs, the old mirrors, the tools of a trade that had nothing to do with warfare. At the window that looked out onto a street where people walked safely, where children played, where the biggest worry was usually whether it would rain. Son, he said, every person who sits in that chair goes home a little better than when they came in. Maybe it's just a good haircut. Maybe it's because someone listened to them for 20 minutes. Maybe it's because they felt cared for in a small way. That's not nothing. Martinez nodded. Besides, Frank continued, the people who need to know what we did, they already know. The people who don't need to know, well, they get to live in a world where they don't have to think about it. That's the whole point. Martinez was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he smiled. The first real smile Frank had seen from him. Colonel Harrison said you'd say something like that. Harrison always was too smart for his own good. Martinez headed toward the door, then paused. Staff Sergeant? Would it be okay if I came back? Maybe made this my regular place? Frank felt something warm in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Doors open every morning at 7. Yes, sir. After Martinez left, Frank stood in the quiet barber shop for a long time. He looked at his reflection in the spotted mirror, saw the old man he'd become, the lines around his eyes, the gray in what was left of his hair. But for the first time in years, he also saw the young Marine he'd been. The one who'd volunteered for missions that didn't exist, who'd brought men home from places that weren't on any map, who'd carried secrets that would die with him. That young Marine hadn't disappeared. He'd just learned to serve in a different way. Frank rolled up his sleeve and looked at the faded tattoo on his forearm. The scar tissue around it was old now, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. But the ink was still there, still clear enough to read if you understood the language. 7th Company. The unit that didn't exist, serving men who needed to know they weren't alone. Frank smiled and rolled his sleeve back down. Outside, the morning was getting brighter, and soon the regular customers would start arriving. Old Pete would complain about his arthritis. Mrs. Rodriguez would want her usual trim and would tip him exactly $2. The high school kid would come in asking for something cool and would leave looking exactly like every other high school kid. And Frank would take care of them all, one at a time, with the same precision and attention he'd once brought to missions that couldn't be discussed. Because that's what warriors did when the war was over. They found new ways to serve. The door chimed and Frank looked up to see his next customer walking in. An older man, maybe 60, with the careful movements of someone dealing with chronic pain. Morning, the man said. I know it's early, but I was hoping you might have time for a trim. Frank gestured to the chair. Always have time. What can I do for you? As the man settled into the chair, Frank noticed the way he positioned himself, the way his eyes checked the exits, the small scar on his neck that looked like it might have come from shrapnel. Frank draped the cape around the man's shoulders and picked up his scissors. Another customer, another story, another chance to serve. So, Frank said, beginning to cut, you new in town, and in the quiet barber shop on the corner of Main and 3rd, 2 warriors who'd never met began the careful dance of recognition that happens when soldiers find each other in civilian clothes. Because some bonds transcend time, transcend wars, transcend the silence that surrounds the things we've done in service of others. And sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons but with scissors and patience and the simple act of caring for another human being. Frank Castellano had found his mission, and it would last him the rest of his life.